Who would call Don Reid, Your Honor?
Don who?
Reid.
Don Reid, Mr. Watson. Come on over here, please. Just step right up to the witness box and raise your right hand.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give you the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Please be seated, sir.
What is your name, sir?
Don Reid,
Where do you live?
Huntsville, Texas.
Are you the author of this book?
I am.
What's the name of that book?
Eyewitness.
And what does that book cover?
Covers my experiences as a death house reporter for the Associated Press between 1938 and July 30th, 1964, when Texas executed its last man.
And,
Covered 189 executions.
and by what method were these executed?
Electricity.
Was this through the use of the electric chair?
Yes.
Okay, and what was your occupation during that period of time?
During that period of time, I held various positions with the Huntsville Item, starting out as a reporter and moving up through the ranks, become editor and then executive editor and finally publisher. And today I'm publisher emeritus and columnist and consultant to the paper, which is part of the Hart Hanks Group.
These 189 persons that you saw executed, did you have prior opportunity to talk with them before they were executed?
Objection to relevancy. Sustained.
Could you relate to the jury your observations concerning the execution of a death sentence by electricity?
Objection to relevancy. Sustained.
Have you ever testified concerning an expert in capital punishment before?
I have.
In what courts of law?
Two previous courts here in Miami. One was on July 5th, I believe. The other one was about a year and a half ago, at Judge Fuller's court, I believe. I've testified in the pretrial hearing of the Dawson 5 case in Dawson, Georgia. Several other cases in Georgia, several in Alabama, one in Mississippi, 5 or 6, as I recall, in Texas, one in Oklahoma, and one in Arkansas.
Have you previously been qualified in those cases as an expert in capital punishment?
I have.
And what, if anything else, concerning capital punishment have you observed besides the executions?
Well, in my own observations, I've come to the conclusion that capital punishment does not solve.
Sustained. Ask the jury to disregard.
Have you ever written any articles on capital punishment?
I have.
Are you familiar with the physical effects of capital punishment by electrocution?
I am.
Have you ever appeared as a speaker either on television or before groups concerning capital punishment?
On numerous occasions.
And have you had, as you say, you've had firsthand experience in observing how this punishment is inflicted, is that true?
That's true.
Your Honor, I would seek to qualify him as an expert in how this punishment is administered.
Take the jury out, Mr. Watson. Ladies and gentlemen, the jury, please prepare to the jury room. Good. Let the court know where we're headed with this witness.
Your Honor, I would submit that Mr. Reid is an expert in the way that society administers capital punishment through electrocution. He has had firsthand knowledge.
Is that an issue in this trial?
Well, Your Honor, the issue at this time is life or death. And since the jury is being asked by the state to recommend a sentence of death, they should be apprised of exactly what it is that they are being asked to do. I don't think without being made aware of how we execute people and how the state kills them and electrocutes them and what are the repercussions. Mr. Reid also has much experience with interviewing these persons, with talking with persons who have suffered capital punishment by
Isn't that a
electrocution.
legislative matter?
Well, Your Honor, it is not strictly a legislative matter because the courts have spoken and have said that whether the death sentence is cruel and unusual punishment must be considered by our juries. That our juries, they say in Witherspoon.
Where have they said that, Ms. Good?
Your Honor, in Witherspoon, they talk about the importance of the jury as the conscience of the community. They've also said this in Woodson, and they've also said it in Coker. And they talk about the fact that...
Now, in Woodson, didn't they go to a great deal of extent in saying that the concept of the punishment or the scope of the punishment was not an issue, but it was in fact the imposition of it that was the issue in question before this jury?
Your Honor, I believe that in Gregg and Prophet and Woodson and all those cases that came out at the same time, they talk about the fact that whether or not whether or not electrocution is a permissible penalty has not yet been finally decided by our contemporary community standards. And they talk about the fact in Coker that when juries reject this kind of punishment as a penalty, then this penalty of death will have reached the point in our society where it is cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. In Witherspoon, they talk about the necessity of the jury to maintain a link between the penal system and between contemporary community standards. That the Eighth Amendment, citing Trope versus Dulles, must always draw its meaning from the evolving standards of decency of the community. And unless this jury is apprised of what the death penalty is and what the state of Florida is asking them to do to Mr. Bundy, then they cannot make an intelligent decision. They cannot assess the community standards or whether they themselves wish this to be a standard of decency of our contemporary society, and whether they wish to reject death as punishment or whether they wish to say that Mr. Bundy should spend the rest of his life in prison.
What say the state?
It's a legislative question, Judge, purely and simply, and to bring this up in front of the jury is totally improper at this stage.
You know, on that objection, I'm almost tempted to let it go in, Mr. Now, here's what's bothering the court. And we might just as well get through with it right now and make some decisions on it. And I'm not going to do it on a half-hearted objection such as just been made. I want the state and I want the defendant to rationalize for me the bases of what the Supreme Court of the United States has said in Woodson, what they've said in Gregg, what they've said in Lockett, what they've said in Prophet. And I want to know what the Supreme Court of Florida has said in Rawlsville. Now, if you are able to give me some argument on that, I will hear you. If you are not, I'm going to let it in. And I'll give you a hint. I think it is very succinctly stated by Justice Rehnquist in his concurring opinion.
referring to Greg, Your Honor?
No, I'm referring primarily to Woodson. I want us to get within the scope of that. I want to hear you some argument. It also talked about it in Wilson in Oklahoma, Williams in Oklahoma, I think was good.
Your Honor, in Woodson, Mr. Justice Rehnquist dissented.
Did he dissent in Woodson? His concurring opinions were in others. There are very few, well, he concurred on the preliminary holding. He did not concur on other two. He had, as I recall, he had statements of both. Let me see the opinion just a second.
At that page, it says he dissents.
Well, I think he dissented as to the.
Head, shaving a spot on his left ankle or leg where the electrodes are attached. In other words, preparing him for the final death march.
Why is the shaving necessary?
Shaving is necessary in order to make a better contact of the electricity, which contacts from the head, makes a complete cycle to the left leg. After the condemned person is brought into the death chamber from death row, there's a slight delay, which the warden asks the defendant if he has anything to say. In some instances, they make a last statement. Some instances, they do not. And then the warden says, "Have a seat, please." And he doesn't say that facetiously. He says it seriously, because it is serious business. And the defendant is, in some cases, escorted to the electric chair, which is just a few feet away. In some instances, the person walks to the chair and sits down on his own power. He's strapped in the chair. The electrodes are affixed. And this all takes about a minute and a half. Then the executioner walks to a little room behind the electric chair, which is the power room. And the first charge of electricity, which is 1800 volts. This causes the body to lift up several inches from the chair in which he is strapped in, causes the veins to pop out his neck, his hands, his face turns purple. In some instances, there is an odor of burnt flesh. Occasionally, there is bleeding from the nose. A piece of cotton is placed under the mask, which hides the face, to catch the dripping of the blood. And then there's a second charge of electricity, which is of a lower voltage, about 400 volts. That's held for about a minute. And then there's a third charge of electricity, which is up to 1400 volts. And this is held also for about a minute. And all this takes around 4 or 5 minutes. And the total time of the time the defendant walks into the death chamber until he's pronounced officially dead is around 6 minutes. And then the body is unstrapped, is placed on a hospital bed, and wheeled out to a waiting ambulance.
Have you had occasion to communicate or to meet persons that were executed?
I've talked to, I would say, most of the people who were executed. There have been some times when they didn't want to talk, and of course that's their privilege. If they don't want to talk to the press, why, they don't have to. But I have visited on death row with most of the 189 people who were executed. I also had the opportunity to visit with them during the last moments of their life on earth, because I was the official press representative during these executions, because the Texas law prescribes who can witness an execution, and while it does not include the press, neither does it exclude the press. And there's a loophole in the law which states that, and anyone else, that the director of the Texas Department of Corrections deems necessary to carry out the mandate of the court. And the directors of the department have named me as the official press representative because they felt that the press should know what's going on.
When you first began observing executions in 1938, were you opposed to the death sentence?
No, not really. I had some mixed feelings about it. I was a lot younger than I am now, and I didn't know as much about the criminal justice system as I do now. And yet, today I don't think I know too much. There's something new going on every day.
That's true of all of us, Mr. Reid.
And I had some mixed emotions. I didn't like what I saw. It's grotesque. It isn't pretty to watch. It takes a strong stomach. And as time went on, I thought, well, I'll get used to this. But I never really got used to it. And several things happened that made me decide once and for all that this was wrong. This was morally wrong. It didn't prove a thing. It didn't return anybody. And it certainly didn't solve our criminal justice problems that we still have today.
What is it that brought you to change your mind concerning the death penalty?
It was a young man about 18 years of age who was convicted for literally stomping to death an aged woman in a $12 robbery. There were 2 other boys involved in the robbery. The 2 other boys pleaded guilty and were given 99 years in prison, which is equivalent of life in prison. On the advice of his attorney, he pleaded not guilty and was given the electric chair, or death by electricity. When the case went to the Court of Criminal Appeals, automatically, they reversed the case on the grounds that the indictment did not specify exactly how this woman was stabbed to death. So they changed the indictment and made it read with his feet. And it was tried again, and they got the death penalty for the second time. This time it was affirmed by the Court of Criminal Appeals, and a date of execution was set. There were a number of people in Dallas who became interested in this young man and wanted to help him. But it seemed that everywhere they turned, while they were turned down by the Board of Pardon and Paroles on a number of occasions. In Texas, recommendations for commutation must come from the Board of Pardon and Paroles. The governor cannot commute a sentence without recommendation from the Board of Pardon and Paroles. And it came time, or came close to the time for him to be executed. The Associated Press asked me if I could do a special story on this young man. I hadn't met him up to that point. And I told him I thought I could, provided he was willing to talk to me. And they said, well, try it. So I went to death row, and he was willing and eager to talk. He wanted to tell somebody something about his life. A fine-looking young man. It was hard for me to understand.
Relevancy, Judge.
Well, she's on a proffer. Court's already ruled as to the relevance. Go ahead.
I tried to picture him on a college campus rather than in prison, in death row particularly. And he told me about his life. He was one of 7 children. Every member of his family had served time in prison, including the mother and father. He said when he was growing up, all he was taught was how to steal. He said, for the first time in my life, I realized that that's not the way. And he said, I find no fault with the system that sentenced me. He said, I'm guilty and I'm ready to pay the penalty. I just want people to know. He said, I hold no malice towards anyone. Well, the story apparently was a better story than even I had imagined, and the Associated Press put it on their international wire, which meant that it went to all member papers all over the world, and suddenly I found myself in the limelight because I received many calls, and there were people that wanted to ask what they could do to help. And despite all of the help from the outside, the board stood fast, and the time for the execution came. The night of the execution, I met the officer who arrested the young man. He said, I understand that you talked with Buster Northern. I said, yes, I did. He said, what do you think about it? I said, well, it's a shame that somebody didn't take this young man and turn him around. I said, he could be turned around very easily. He could become a force for good rather than a force for evil. But I said, I think it's too late now. His reply was quite classic, because he said, well, you don't know him like I do. It's going to be a pleasure to watch him die. Came time to go to the death chamber. They brought Buster in, and the warden said, do you have anything to say? He said, yes. He said, I hold no malice towards anyone. I want to thank prison officials, people on the outside who have tried to help me. I'm guilty. I'm ready to pay the penalty. Right now, I would like to recite the Lord's Prayer. Warden said, why not? He kneeled, and the chaplain placed his hand on his shaved head, repeated the Lord's Prayer, got up, he smiled, he winked at me, walked to the chair. Several minutes later, he was dead. The telephones in the Texas prison system are not on the inside. as you can well imagine. So I had to go quite a ways to get to a phone to call the story in. I noticed one thing as I left death chamber, that the officer who was standing next to me was no longer there. I thought perhaps he couldn't stand the smell of the burnt flesh and had to get out and get a little fresh air. So I left, and while I was walking across the prison yard, I saw this officer sitting on a tree stump with his head buried in his hands, crying. So I walked over there and I said, "My friend, what's troubling you?" He said, "You know something? I heard that boy pray. Suddenly I wanted to reach out to him and say, 'Son, everything is going to be all right.'" Well, I had two stories that night. One of the conversion of the police officer, and the other, of course, the death of Buster Northern. And I really had a third story. And from then, that point on, I decided that I was going to look into these cases. I was going to determine, and I was going to do all I could to bring about the end of capital punishment, if at all possible, and give us something that society can live with.
And have you looked into the records and the cases of people that have been executed
I
in
have.
Texas? And could you tell us the results of your studies?
Results of my study have indicated that of the little over 500 men who were originally sent to death row, 361 were executed. The balance, in several cases, they died before it was time for execution. In some cases, they died after their sentences were commuted. And it left 85 people who had their sentences commuted to life in prison. And of that 85, 37 were paroled from prison after serving the required number of years as set out by the legislature. And of that 37 that were paroled, as of right now, only 2 were returned to prison as parole violators. And in each instance, the reason that they were sent back to prison was for driving while intoxicated. Both of them served about a year in prison, and as one official said, to get them dried out. And the parole board finally approved their parole again with the admonition to go back to your jobs. You're doing all right, but we warn you, if you have to drink, drink at home.
Are you familiar with any examples of persons who have reformed or changed their lives around once they've been sentenced to life imprisonment or once their death sentence has been commuted to life?
Well, there's been a number. Of course, one very recently was on Clyde Thompson, who was considered for many years the meanest man in the Texas prison system. And he was sentenced to electric chair for murder when he was 17 years old. And while in prison, he tried his best to be the worst convict that they had, and he just about succeeded. Spent 12 years in isolation. Totally, he spent 28 years in prison before he was paroled. And somebody sent him a Bible while he was in isolation. And he, in his own words, and he wrote a book about this called X83, that was his execution number, in which he said that the only reason he wanted to read that Bible was to keep from going crazy. And of course, the other reason was he wanted to prove all of the inaccuracies of the Bible, which he couldn't do. And this convinced him that there must be a better way. And people took an interest in his case, and they finally got him out of isolation. It took 5 years to get him out of isolation. That's the type of record he had. But once he got out of isolation, he started holding Bible classes for inmates. This was back in the days before the Texas Department of Corrections had a big rehabilitation program like they have today with chaplains and so forth and so on. And then in 1955, after serving 28 years in prison, the Church of Christ got him out of prison on parole. And he became a Church of Christ prison minister. And until his death about 2 weeks ago in Lubbock, he was the prison minister for the Lubbock Church of Christ. He had baptized more than 1,500 people. He started the first halfway house in our town of Huntsville, Texas. He's worked all these years, and everything he's written, another book, and everything that he has written has been with one idea, is to prove to people in prison that there is a way of salvation, provided they take it.
And is it not true that persons, even though they are destined to spend the rest of their lives in prison, can work for the good of society?
Oh, absolutely. You can talk to correctional people, penal people all over the world, as I have. I've attended many meetings of the Correctional Association, and they'll tell you that they can't operate a prison without some good lifers, people with intelligence, people who obey the rules, and people who can help them.
Is this still part of your proffer?
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, this testimony is not within the ambit of the court's ruling. You're aware of that?
I did want him to testify to his experiences and studies concerning persons that could...
Well, I think testimony relative to the possibility of rehabilitation is admissible before the jury, and don't want that to be considered part of the court's ruling if it is offered in proper juncture. It's only as to the character of the punishment that the court is going to restrict you on, Ms. Good.
Then I would like to hear have the jury.
I think you're entitled to that under Lockett.
Hear his testimony in this regard.
So we clearly understand the court's ruling, and Mr. Reid understands the court ruling, and all of us. The testimony about the usability and the utility of people, even though sentenced to life imprisonment, I think is probative under Lockett. That Lockett seems to indicate testimony relative to the probability of rehabilitation is admissible. And the state has contra thought, I'll hear from them, but I think that's clearly the law as one of the things, and I didn't want that to be confused in the proffer. It's only as to the character that I'm restricting you of. And if you want to go into that with Mr. Reid, and if that concludes your proffer on the character, we'll bring the jury back in unless the state has some cross on the proffer.
No, sir.
And we'll take your questions one at a time. Do you have anything else on the proffer as to the character of the punishment?
I would ask some other questions, Your Honor, concerning his studies regarding deterrence of the death penalty.
Concerning what? I didn't hear that one word.
Deterrence, that the death penalty is not a deterrent, that he has
Well, I
done...
think that goes to the character also. You may continue on your proffer of that.
All right. Mr. Reid, have you ever done any studies concerning the deterrent effect of capital punishment?
I have.
Could you tell us about those, please?
Well, I've talked to a great many inmates whose cases indicated that they could have received the death penalty. They received a lesser penalty from the court. And in almost all instances, the question was, didn't you realize that you could have gotten the electric chair for this? And invariably, the answer would come back, well, I never thought about it. And then when you look into it a little further, you find that many of them say, well, they don't send too many people to the electric chair for committing the type of crimes that come under that guideline of what is a capital crime at that time.
And have you drawn any conclusions concerning whether the death sentence is a deterrent for further murder or further crime?
In my opinion, I can't see that the death sentence is a deterrent. The only person it deters would be the one to be executed.
I would like to ask him questions concerning the ability of persons to work for good while they are incarcerated for the rest of their life.
I have no problem with that. I think that's admissible, Ms. Good. Do you have any questions or any cross on the proffer?
No, sir.
Are you concluded with the proffer?
I believe so, Your Honor.
All right. Bring a jury on in, Mr. Watson.
Yes, sir. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, please take your seats in the jury box, take your original seats. Jury's present, sir.
Another prior stipulation, polling is waived and presence is noted. You may proceed, Ms. Good.
Mr. Reid, you presently work with inmates in the correctional system in Texas?
Almost every day.
In what capacity?
Well, there are a number of capacities. I lecture to pre-release inmates. Also, we conduct a sort of a post-release inmate program, which is a community type of thing that a parole commissioner and myself started several years ago that's been very successful. We have volunteer workers that meet with the inmates and their families or their families as they are discharged and offer coffee, cokes. It's kind of a USO type of thing, how to get to the bus station, what to do to cash your checks and so forth and so on, because they're in a new society and a lot of them are very bewildered, even though they may have not been bewildered when they first went to prison. When they get out, they're bewildered. And I serve as the unofficial advisor to the inmate publication. And also I serve on the Windham School District Executive Committee, which is an independent school district which operates entirely within the Texas Department of Corrections.
And through your work with inmates, have you ever observed the ability of inmates to work for good while they are under a sentence of life imprisonment?
It amazes me, it really does, to see the talent that some of these people have. And when you look into their backgrounds and find where they came from and how they got there, it's a wonder to me that they do as well. And then when you turn to their supervisors, the prison officials, they'll tell you quickly that we depend upon people of this caliber to help us operate the prisons.
Are persons who are called lifers or those under sentence of life imprisonment necessary to the operation?
Not necessarily. Of course, a lifer refers to a lifer, but we have people in Texas who are serving 500, so-called 500 years, 1,000 years, 200 years, 99 years, and of course it's meaningless as far as the practical part is concerned, because they're all considered to be serving 60 years for the sake of figuring, and then your parole comes from that. But it's interesting to note, and I want to bring this up, In 1972, when the United States Supreme Court said that capital punishment for all practical purposes was cruel and unusual, we had 42.
Objection.
I would sustain that as relates to what, that wasn't all of the holding. It outlawed it, and you may amend it to say that it outlawed those present standards. Go ahead, Mr. Reid.
What happened to the persons that were on death row when the death sentence became unconstitutional in 1972?
All of them had their sentences commuted to life in prison. And all of them today are gainfully, quote and unquote, employed in the mainstream of the Texas Department of Corrections, doing important tasks. One fellow who was on death row for 13 years, last year was president of the Huntsville Walls JCs. And I heard him conduct a meeting. It amazed me how well he did. And they've enrolled in the school system. Some of them have gone to college and doing all the other things to try to develop skills that would help them while they are in prison.
So you are personally familiar with the power of conversion and that people can be turned around to work for good in society?
Definitely.
Even while they are in prison for life?
Right.
And have you met with Ted Bundy?
Yes, I have.
And have you talked with him?
I talked to him last night.
Do you believe that Ted Bundy could live a useful, productive life while incarcerated for life?
Well, from my, what an expert is, a fellow away from home. And I guess I can qualify myself as an expert.
You got a
since
briefcase also.
Yeah.
Mr. Reid.
Since
That's the
I'm-
other part of the definition.
Since I'm away from home. But I tried to relate what I saw there with countless other people that I have known who were incarcerated in the Texas Department of Corrections. And I thought to myself, now here's a young fellow with a pretty good background, a better than average education that we find in prison. Here's a fellow that could do a lot of good to help the Florida Department of Corrections operate.
I have no further questions.
Mr. Reid, do you know any of the facts of the cases under which he's been convicted?
The only thing I know of is what I've read in the papers and what he told me last night.
And your studies, they've all been in Texas prisons? Have you ever worked in Florida?
No, I never have. I've been to Florida on a number of occasions, but I've never worked in Florida. I've been in Texas practically all my life, with the exception of the little time I spent at the University of Chicago and living in that area and going to school there.
And I believe you stated, or do you know, what the minimum time a lifer serves in Texas?
Well, today it would be 20 years because the law's been changed. Now, heretofore, it was 1/3 of your accumulated time. Well, we have the good time law. We don't pay our inmates for working. We pay them in time, 15 days a month, 20 days a month, or 30 days a month, depending on classification. In other words, a state-approved trustee can cut his sentence in half. And if he was a lifer, which for all practical purposes, 60 years, 1/3 of that would be 20 years. Half of that would be 10 years. Up until last year, the average stay of a lifer was about 12 years. Now he's got to spend a minimum of 20 calendar years before he can be considered for parole.
And when did that change? When did that come about?
At the last session of the legislature.
So most of your studies were done under a different
Right.
situation. And most of your studies, I know it's hard to generalize, you have so many years in the field, but most of your studies were done at a time when lifers were getting out in what, 12, 15 years?
Right.
That's all I have, Judge.
Mr. Reid, have you been familiar with life prisoners in the prison system of Texas in the last few years since
Yes,
they
I
changed
have.
the law?
Yes, I
And
have.
have you seen people who were life prisoners under this kind of heavy minimum sentence also working for good within the prison?
Absolutely.
It hasn't been a disruptive influence.
It hasn't been a destructive influence at all. In fact, In some cases, it's been better for this reason. You're taking our educational program. If we assign somebody to take a technical course that requires a lot of skill, well, if he's only going to be there for 6 months or a year, that's wasting taxpayers' money. We can't train him in that time and give him a journeyman certificate. So they feel it's an advantage to them to get into a program that is meaningful.
That's all.
I have no complaints.
May Mr. Reid be excused?
Yes, sir.
I think he's free to go back to Texas, Mr. Reid.
Well, if I don't get thrown out of a taxi cab, I can make it.
The court vouch not for transportation between here and the airport. Go ahead. Who is your next witness?
Gordon Waldo.
Gordon who? Waldo?
Waldo.
Doesn't answer, sir.
He should be in the courtroom across the hall in 4-2. I know he's here.
Try another one.
How about John Kerry?
Maybe you better go take inventory, see who you got over there, Miss Good, and see.
I apologize, Your Honor.
He doesn't answer either.
Well, Your Honor, could we have about I could go round them up, I'm sure, because they came to the courthouse with me this morning, and they are
One
friends,
of
so
your
maybe they
men's
would.
going to look in your office, see if they're there.
Does anyone check the bathroom?
Well, it's too early for that, Miss Good.
Now, may I have your excuse for just a few
Yeah,
minutes?
go see if you can find him. You might have more traction than Mr. Watson does.
I apologize, Your Honor, he was waiting in the courtroom across the hall, but they're having court today too.
Step up in the witness box, please.